your ability to diagnose different brain types speaks directly to technology that you've been able to develop and leverage at Amen Clinics that studies activity in specific parts of the brain.
So we've been using a study called brain SPECT imaging. It's a nuclear medicine study that looks at blood flow and activity. It looks at how your brain works. And it basically shows us three things: good activity, too little, or too much. And then based on what we see, we work to balance your brain.
Welcome to Commune. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, and bring the world closer together.
Welcome to the Commune podcast. Great to be with you.
So great to be with you. Makes me happy.
Well, if there is, I suppose, any single project that unites all of humanity, it is our individual quest to be happy. And you have dedicated the better part of your life to understanding the human brain, but specifically in relationship to happiness. And I'd love to spend some time talking about that generally. And then, of course, you've recently published a book this year called You Happier, which delves into the 4 circles of and 7 secrets to happiness and walks us through all sorts of neuroscience-based tools and habits and choices that we can adopt to lead a happier and purpose-driven life. So, and I gotta say that this work could not be more timely, just given the state of the world. Few people actively choose to be unhappy, but I think it's clear that rates of depression and addiction and mental illness are cresting. I was reading some statistics about suicide rates that have increased some 30 some odd percent over the last generation. So those are just like a couple metrics that I think indicate as a society that we are patently unhappy. So your work is so important. So I'm excited to explore the secrets of finding happiness that you outline in your book. But I wonder if we could start at the opposite end of the equation, and you could outline what are some of the conditions and behaviors that lead to unhappiness.
Well, so many things. Our society is really against us. And I wrote a book a number of years ago called The Brain Warrior's Way, because I just came to believe you're in a war for the health of your brain. Everywhere you go, someone is trying to shove bad food down your throat that will kill you early. And it's a fascinating new study I've been thinking about, where they took sugar, stevia, and sucralose, or Splenda, and they measured their learning and memory and executive function before and after 6 weeks, and even did some brain imaging work. And, sugar is just rampant. There's 150 pounds of sugar on average. That's what people eat a year. And, the little yellow packets are just everywhere. And what they found was stevia really didn't do anything negative to brain function. But sugar decreased learning, so encoding memories. But Splenda decreased encoding memory or learning, long-term memory, and executive function. So you just pop 3 or 4 of those little yellow packets in your coffee, and you're more likely to make a bad decision. And it also showed increased slow wave activity in the front part of your brain, which means your brake's not working that well. And these substances are just everywhere. And if you mix that with the negative news, which I always say the news is no longer the news. The news is about scaring you to keep your eyeballs there longer. So the people who advertise will make more money. And then addictive gadgets. And it's a mess. And that's why we've seen increasing rates of anxiety, depression, ADHD, which is quadrupled since I was in my training to be a child psychiatrist. I mean, it's just nuts how these things are going the wrong way. Not to mention, obesity has just continued to skyrocket. And there's a connection between physical health and mental health. I published 3 studies that showed as your weight goes up, the actual physical size and functioning of the brain goes down. And so I'm not a big fan of the body positivity movement. It's like, well, it doesn't really matter if you take care of your body. It's like, no, it matters.
Mm.
Why did we force people really to wear helmets when they ride a motorcycle? Because it's not just about you. Is if you get a bad head injury, everybody's got to pay for that. And
Right.
I think the same thing is true with health. It's not just about you. Ultimately, it's about generations of you.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. I mean, we really do live within a holobiont, a mutually interdependent system. Even though day to day we feel like individuals, we are incredibly interconnected. And I think it's interesting around the body positivity movement. I think there's a delineation there between not shaming people, but also being able to be honest about science. And as you say, correlations, for example, between obesity and depression. Um, so I think that I'm glad to hear you say that, and I think it's an interesting point, and I think it's a needle to thread because oftentimes, I'm sure you've looked at food deserts, for example, these areas where people can only avail themselves of processed food or convenience store food, and so and the rates of diabetes and obesity and diabetes in those neighborhoods are disproportionately high. So we can't necessarily blame those people for their condition. At the same time, we need to be able to have honest scientific conversation that shows some of these correlations.
Yeah, no, we don't want to blame anybody, but we also don't want to lie. We don't want to be in denial. And, the food deserts, those people are victims of the war going on in our society. But you can't say there's not a war because there is. And your brain uses 20 to 30% of the calories you consume. And so if you don't give it the proper nutrition, then it's not going to function right. And if it's not going to function right, you'll never really get out of poverty because, getting out of poverty, yes, of course, it's opportunity, but it's opportunity mixed with decision making. And if we don't nourish the organ of decision making, we're going to continue with all the bad decisions that are happening. And, monster corporations, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, whatever, they're making lots of money off of our early death. And then other corporations like Pfizer or Eli Lilly, they're making lots of money, not really fixing the problem because, and I'm a psychiatrist. I heard that psychiatrists really didn't want to be in the order business or psychiatric medication companies. They didn't want to be in the order business, like with antibiotics, take it, get rid of your pneumonia and you're better. They wanted to be in the reorder business. So once you took an antidepressant, they wanted you to keep taking it. And that's a bad model because the medications many psychiatrists use, and I'm not opposed to medicine, so I don't want to go there. But if I put you on certain medications, they change your brain to need them in order for you to feel normal. And that's a problem. And so when I went to medical school, they just hammered us with first do no harm use the least toxic, most effective treatments. And so happiness is not generally found in antidepressants. Now, they often will decrease depression, but at the same time, they decrease happiness because they numb you. And so when I think of happiness, I think the first foundational secret of happiness is you need a healthy brain. Because if your brain's not healthy, if it doesn't have adequate blood flow and neurotransmitters, you're not going to be happy, right? I mean, and we all hear stories of people who are extremely successful, famous, who kill themselves because they weren't happy. And oftentimes it came from a brain that was unhealthy, which could have come from a head injury or could have come from COVID because COVID changes the brain in a negative way, or Lyme disease, or mercury toxicity, or a whole host of other problems I talk about in the book.
Yeah, I think the point that you make, that the brain is really the hardware and you have to tend to the functionality of the brain first before you do the programming, I think is a salient one. And, you do a great job in the book outlining all of these contributing factors in our society that lead to unhappiness. So we talk about sugar or alcohol. You brought up McDonald's, for example, that very specifically markets a package of food called the Happy Meal, and you address this straight on in the book. But the Happy Meal makes you patently unhappy if you're looking at really the knock-on impacts of what that kind of food does to your physiology. And it seems that more often than not, short-term pleasure is maladaptive to long-term happiness. And I think you can trace that in many aspects. I mean, I think you also talk quite eloquently about this craving that we have in the modern world for the latest tech gadgets or the shiny new object that's always out there on the horizon, and the hedonic treadmill that can put us on.
And wears out the pleasure centers in your brain. The pleasure centers are real. It's an area called the nucleus accumbens. It responds to dopamine with happiness and motivation and drive. And when you hit those too hard, too often, you begin to wear them out, and then you feel flat. And I talk about fame, and I've been blessed to see a number of really famous people who I adore, but you never want to dump dopamine. You want to drip dopamine. So it's an interesting concept I've been thinking about for a long time, right? If you're Miley Cyrus and you're on tour in Argentina and you have thousands of people cheering you and pounding on your car, initially it's awesome. But then over time, it's not awesome. It's irritating and agitating, and because it's worn out your pleasure stores. So no wonder these young stars started using alcohol or marijuana or cocaine. The problem is it wears them out further and they end up to be a mess.
Many people out there would be very surprised to know that there are various different brain types, and your ability to diagnose different brain types speaks directly to technology that you've been able to develop and leverage at Amen Clinics that studies activity in specific parts of the brain. So I wonder if you could take a minute and describe how you do this.
So for the last 32 years at Amen Clinics, we've been using a study called brain SPECT imaging. It's a nuclear medicine study that looks at blood flow and activity. It looks at how your brain works. And it basically shows us three things: good activity, too little, or too much. And then based on what we see, we work to balance your brain. But very early on, I realized there was not one form of depression. I actually hate the diagnosis of depression because it's sort of like chest pain. Nobody gets a diagnosis of chest pain because it doesn't tell you what's causing it, and it doesn't tell you what to do for it. And, as I sort of subtype depression, anxiety, ADHD, addiction, I'm like, well, sort of everybody's different. That there are balanced people that overall are just sort of normal and healthy, but that's not the majority. They're spontaneous people that have sleepy frontal lobes. They're persistent people where their frontal lobes actually work too hard and they can be worried, rigid, and flexible. If things don't go their way, they get upset. I mean, they're normal, but rigid. And then there's sensitive people that crave relationships and cautious people that crave safety. And I'm like, oh, so these are the 5 primary types. Now, they have combinations of these types. So there's a total of 16 types. In the book, I actually teach people how to know their type. And it's, without coming to the clinic and getting a scan. And I find it's just so helpful. We've done 5 million brain type tests. And one of my new doctors sent me hers and she goes, it's so right on. And I'm like, is there anybody in your family that has a history of addiction? And her dad was a raging alcoholic. Because with type 6, where you tend to be impulsive and compulsive, it often goes with addictions.
Does activity in certain parts of the brain have any correlation to the production of certain hormones and neurotransmitters? And I suppose, what is the relationship between neuromodulators and happiness in general?
Well, for this book, we actually studied happiness. We gave 500 consecutive patients the Oxford Happiness Questionnaire, and then we looked at their scans. And people who scored high on happiness had the healthiest brains. People who scored low on happiness had lower blood flow, especially to the front part of the brain. And the pleasure centers, talked earlier about the nucleus accumbens, they had decreased activity in that part of the brain. So if you're doing things to decrease blood flow to your brain, like smoking or vaping, alcohol, marijuana, not exercising, being overweight, you're just less likely to be happy.
I wonder if you could dissect why people that play racket sports tend to have healthier brains and greater longevity and health span.
Right. People play racket sports live longer than everybody else. And I think it's because they activate the cerebellum in the back bottom part of the brain. Cerebellum is Latin for little brain, and it has half the brain's neurons. And so if you're getting your eyes and hands and feet all working together while you think about strategy and the spin on the ball, that is really a whole brain exercise. And so much better for you than football or soccer, running, even weightlifting, because of the coordination exercise while you're doing something that's aerobic. It's a very special and something I think everyone should do. Like, I'm a huge fan. Let's get football out of schools because it's brain damaging, and let's get ping pong tables and tennis rackets in.
Yeah, well, I hereby publicly challenge you to a ping pong match. I think you have the advantage. You have the upper hand on a table of that dimension, but maybe we'll start there. Well, Dr. Daniel Amen, thank you so much for spending this time with us today on the Commune podcast. I know how important this topic is. And I'm not just saying that because we recently put a survey out to our 1.5 million active email community. And the number one issue that came back was brain health. And I'm not surprised per se, but to see the numbers like that, it was astounding. And so, like I said, your work could not be more timely. And of course, you've dedicated the better part of your life to it. So very grateful for that.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this interview from the Commune podcast, then click subscribe and check out this video right here.